Welcome back to another Lich King card review. This time around we got Shaman cards and Priest cards, Big Shaman and Shadow Priest in particular. A couple legendaries, starting off here with Overlord Drakuru, a new 9-mana 6/8 with Rush and Wind Fury, and it reads, after this attacks and kills a minion, resurrect it on your side. So potentially a nice little swing card here. Maybe your opponent has a 3/3 and a 4/4 and you kill those off. You're left with a 6/1 Wind Fury and a couple extra minions. So you've tidied up your opponent's board and developed a little bit of a threat of your own as well. And although we do love swing cards in Hearthstone, it's really nice when you can flip a board in your favor. Boy, I wonder if the Overlord Drakuru here is just a pretty hefty price to pay at 9 mana. In particular, when I compare this to cards like, say, Raid Boss Onyxia, right? 1 additional mana for Onyxia, but you get an 8/8 with Immune, which, by the way, will kind of develop your own board, much like the stuff that the Drakuru might be summoning in that case. And you get a bunch of 2/1s to attack as well, right? So Onyxia does like 8, and 12 damage is 20 damage. This guy can do 14, but he can only attack twice. So a lot of board shapes and board styles just aren't going to line up well for Overlord Drakuru, particularly if he needs to like hit into an 8/8 or something. He's just going to die. There is not going to be a Wind Fury if he's dead. So compared to a lot of other like sort of rush reactive swingy cards we have in Hearthstone, man, this just does not line up very favorably comparatively. Even at 1 mana cheaper, it's still in that same bucket of like big high cost things you're looking to play. Now Shaman is going to get some like big spell synergy or big minion synergy stuff here. We're going to talk about a few other cards obviously that seem to be synergizing and playing into like all of these big minions. But man, I don't really feel like this is the right kind of payoff, nor is this the significant enough swing card to really drive an archetype like this one forward. For such an expensive card, you need something that fits a lot of different game states, that can be really threatening in its own right, can address a variety of board shapes. You know, if there's 5 minions out, this is terrible, while something like Raid Boss Onyxia could still be pretty amazing if there's 5 minions out. Now we're going to see some synergy stuff for this card that, you know, I think opens up opportunities a little bit because of some forced attacks and things. This could be better. It doesn't have a battle cry, say like Raid Boss Onyxia. So, you know, it's going to be better when like summoned out of hand or cheated out of hand. So there are some angles for this card, but I'm still not convinced it's going to make enough sense in those contexts. This is just a really high premium on all of these cards. It's costing a lot, and I don't think they're swingy enough or impactful enough to really substantiate such a high cost. This is gonna be a tough package to get there. So let's go ahead and talk about one of those. This is from the other side, a new 10 mana shadow spell for Shaman. And this one's going to summon a copy of each minion in your hand. They attack random enemy minions, then die. So this is kind of a cool big board clear that might play nicely with Death Rattle stuff. It might play nicely with Drakuru because he's going to attack something that's going to kill it, hopefully, and then resurrect it on your side. So you're left a little bit of board here from the other side if you have Death Rattles or Drakuru potentially. And this is copies, so you're not really sacrificing any value here. The challenge, of course, is this is a 10 mana spell. That is the kind of big late game board swing stuff that takes a long time to get there on. Like, are you just going to be sitting on all these big cards in your hand throughout the entire game, waiting to get to 10 mana before you can finally play them? Also, 10 mana like board reactions like this are often too late. Your opponent has already swarmed you down. They've already started murdering you. And by the time this comes online, it's probably just going to be too late to matter. I think that's going to cause some real problems from this. So this demands like this really specific deck construction. This demands the right kind of hand to make this good. You probably need like 3-4 minions to really feel good about this one if you're actually going to use it to react to opponents' boards effectively. So you've got deck construction problems, you've got hand context issues. Frankly, you need good board shapes to use this against. If your opponent doesn't have a board, this is going to feel a little bit worse. You're just going to summon a bunch of stuff that might die, and then, yeah, maybe you realize some Death Rattle upsides, but probably don't feel great about it because you've lost a lot of the value here, which is killing your opponent's stuff. So, I mean, man, this is really expensive. I think it's going to be a little bit awkward, and it's going to demand a lot of you, all of which are often recipes for failure. I just don't see how this package is going to make sense with all of these just insanely high cost things sitting around waiting to make plays forever. Now, that said, this card does solve that problem a little bit. This is Prescience, a new 4-mana spell, Shadow again. This one draws 2 minions, which that helps you fill your hand for your big like 10 mana play. And for each that costs 5 or more, you summon a 2/3 spirit with Taunt. So you're getting potentially some nice tempo here if you can build your deck in a way where you're not likely to draw smaller stuff. So maybe all your minions cost 5 or more to increase the reliability here. You get a couple 2/3s, that helps you slow down your opponent while also filling up your hand for that big stuff later. But you will notice there is a pretty substantial gap here from 4 mana to 10 mana or 9 mana. The Shaman did get the new 5 mana Taunt Death Rattle guy as well. I guess I'll pull him up real quick so we can take a fresh reminder there if you haven't seen this one in a minute or two. I'm stalling as we get to it. The Harkener of Dread, this guy, 5 mana 2/2 Taunt, Death Rattle, summon a 6/6 undead with Taunt. So, this is the kind of minion that might follow up nicely on curve after the Prescience, but then, he's not in hand for your From the Other Side if you're playing him out. So there's still just these little gaps in this package, and there's this mana to fill and occupy that really feel like it's going to make it hard to get all of this working. Now, I mean, this card does do a lot, drawing 2 cards, number 1, and there's specific things, which is great. So this could just be like a minion tutor outside of a big deck if you just need to fill up your hand with stuff. And then of course also just getting some bodies down, like all of that's great. This is a card that looks good and makes sense, but if it's only ever being used to support the rest of this package that doesn't make sense, that might be a death knell for it. It's, I think, maybe going to have to exist outside of this big spell package or big minion package if we're expecting this card to be good. There might be other reasons or other worlds where you're just running some big minions, maybe not like this big slow minion package, but just have some awesome legendaries or late game bombs or something, or Prescience just fills in as a card draw tool, setting up combos or whatever other sort of thing. So I like this card certainly a lot more than its peers here in this set, and it does do a lot. So this one's pretty intriguing, perhaps even outside of the context of the rest of these synergies. And then we have one more big minion here. This is actually one I ran into during the Death Knight event. This guy was a real pain getting randomly summoned off of the Scourge. It's the Bright Blood Berserker, an 8 mana 3/8 undead. He's got Taunt and Lifesteal and Reborn and Death Rattle, deal 3 damage to a random enemy. Keep in mind with that Death Rattle, that's also going to have Lifesteal because that's him doing the damage. So there's a lot of healing bundled into this card across 2 bodies. This is the kind of thing, like when this gets played, if your opponent is minion based, if they have to attack into this guy could easily be healing 6, 9, 12 or more damage very, very often. Consistently, I'd say we'll get like 12 is pretty likely. So a big stabilizer. I do like this card actually a little bit more even than the legendary like Drakuro here, because I think this one just creates a lot of awkwardness and a lot of friction as the opponent tries to figure out ways to deal with it because of this Reborn and because of this Death Rattle. It's going to be hard to chunk your way through this one, and I think that's going to feel really nice. It's still coming down really late compared to other cards we've seen like this in the past. You know, if you think about like a Kartut Defender, a Healy, Reborn, Taunty kind of guy, right? There's also been like the Obsidian statue for Priest, but remember that got cheated into play by Priest, and that's what made it good. So 8 mana might come a little late in the curve and late in the game again compared to all these other cards. It still seems like everything's happening a couple turns later than I'd like for these sort of stabilizers to start hitting, and we don't really see any ways to cheat them out right now. It's more about just getting them ready for those big swings later. So again, this card does do a lot. It has a lot happening, and that's usually a good sign, much like Prescience. Like, these are putting enough pieces together that I'm more hopeful for both of these cards finding some kind of home, even if it's not in this one cohesive package. Existing in a control deck or some other environment seems possible for these, whereas with Drakuru and the From the Other Side in particular, those seem like they're going to have a much harder time. So next up here, we've got Priest and a new Priest legendary, Sister Svalna. This one got leaked a little bit in the Death Knight event. She's a 6 mana 6/6 undead with Battlecry. Permanently add a Vision of Darkness to your hand. And this is the part people hadn't seen before. Vision of Darkness is a 3 mana spell that allows you to discover a shadow spell, and it will just stay in your hand forever. So even if you just want to play like 3 of these in a turn, you can. They're going to just keep refilling in your hand. So this is basically an infinite value generator for Priest, and I think there's a couple ways to use that, of course. Number one could just be you're playing a control deck and you want to make sure you have a lot of stuff and you need to have cards and you just want to make sure you can outvalue your opponents. Well, here you go. This is an infinite value card, and I'm, by the way, a little distracted because I'm pulling up shadow spells for you to take a look at. These are the current shadow spells in Priest. As you can see, despite being shadowy, there's a lot of removal here. There's sometimes even more value generation, but a lot of like responsive cards and removal cards in particular, a little bit of healing even with Void Shard and Devouring Plague. So the value is definitely here for a card like this one, and getting to discover means you're going to have a pretty good chance to find the kind of thing that you need. The question is, number one, is this 3 mana tax too high? Basically, you always have to pay 3 mana, and then of course you're going to have to spend the mana again on the spell that you actually discover. So you're committing a lot to just see what the spell is, and that's a big tax to pay over and over and over again. The other side is like Priest is not really lacking for value these days. Priest has lots of ways to make stuff where they don't have to continually pay this 3 mana tax every time they want to do it. There's just not siphoning 3 mana off of them each and every time. So the other question for this card is like, maybe this could be the top end in a Shadow Priest. Like you have an aggressive Shadow Priest deck and you know, you start to gas out because you're playing a lot of faster cards, more aggressive cards, and maybe you hit Sister Svalna and she's the top of your curve, and now that you've run out of gas, you can just start discovering new cards to help you close out and finish out a game. In that case, I'm actually a little bit worried that these shadow cards don't really have much of an aggressive slant to them. Most of them are actually rather defensive in nature. Like, yeah, Void Shard can go face, but you're only going to get that one every few plays. So I don't even know if this is the card that could be great at like closing out for a shadow deck. I think between paying, you know, 6 mana for a flat 6/6, that's not an exciting play at all. Getting a Boulder Fist Ogre right off the bat, that's not even a Boulder Fist Ogre, pretty bad. And then again, spending more and more dead mana just to find additional cards. Basically, you got 9 mana into this card before it does anything, and then it takes a long time and a lot more mana to keep realizing the benefit here. So I don't really know which kind of priest deck cares about this. Like, why does a value priest or controlled priest need this? They have other ways to win games, other ways to generate plenty of value to grind people down. Like Thief Priest package, for instance, just makes so much stuff. Shadow priests don't care about it. Maybe there's some world where you're trying to run this specifically with Radiant Elementals, where you've got cost discounts and you're just chaining somehow, you know, 1 mana Visions of Darkness, or maybe you can make 3 Radiants because you're getting a copy spell. That's certainly not impossible. And you get infinite Vision of Darkness, and you just keep playing these for 0 mana over and over again, and you use that for some kind of cheese, or just find enough Void Shards to win, although those are going to cost 1 mana, I guess, as a 4 mana card. So like, that's a possibility, but that feels very fringe and really specific, and not something that would be like reliable or something to build the deck around. So ultimately, every time I try to break down this card and figure out who cares about it, I can't really find a good answer for it. I think ultimately it just doesn't really solve any problems, and it also just feels really, really expensive, which means for me, this card just doesn't get there. Next up here, we have the Crystal Smith Cultist, a new 1 mana 1/2 battle cry. If you're holding a shadow spell, gain +1/+1. So this could be a nice little 2/3 for 1 mana. And we've seen some faster Shadow Priest decks that do care about getting minions down on board and being a little bit aggressive with their openers. And I think it's possible that the Crystal Smith Cultist makes a home in those decks. I will say, though, for those like Benedict to Shadow Priest, they don't actually run that many shadow spells. Like they want that hero power, so they limit themselves to shadow spells, but there's not actually like a lot in hand, which might really reduce the consistency here of the Crystal Smith Cultist. And I think you need this to hit pretty much every time if you're going to want this to be worth it, because the 2/3 stat line is great for 1 mana, but it's not so great that you're willing to sacrifice it, right? There are other things that are just more consistent and might be just a better early opener that are just, you know, reliable and aren't going to fail half the time or more. So I think it would take a pretty darn specific build for the Crystal Smith Cultist to actually be a relevant card. Which, I mean, maybe like a control deck wants to run this just to get an early body down that takes trades. Maybe there's a deck that's running some buffs that cares about this, but I think you'd rather have a high health total unit like get one of those 1/4s or something to build off of instead of just the 2/3 stat line here. So yeah, I think it's gonna be very, very rare that this card gets played. It kind of makes sense, but the inconsistency is definitely gonna hold this one back. Overlord Drakuru is a 2-star card. Blightblood Berserker is a 3-star card. Prescience is a 3-star card. From the Other Side is a 2-star card. Sister Svalna is a 2-star card. Crystalsmith Cultist is a 3-star card. Yeah, unfortunately, not a lot of love for these particular cards. Man, I'm curious if you guys are as down on this batch as I am. Are these actually going to be way too slow? Or are you seeing some angle, some line where these are getting played? Share those thoughts and more down in the comments below. But until then, thanks so much for watching. And until next time, game on.